Another helpful hint on EdSite, I am going to make this multiple select thing on number 8 bigger and bolder so you definitely see it. But do you see how these buttons don't say A, B, C, D, they're just open? So when you decide to click on them, you can click multiple ones. This little X is also an answer eliminator, so you can click on that answer eliminator and X out the ones that you know aren't correct. It's just an added thing that you can do if you want to in EdSite. Okay, let's move on with number 9. Solve the quadratic equation by completing the square. When we complete the square, that's where we want to take these two terms and figure out what would finish that to make that a perfect square trinomial. So I'm going to take x squared minus 4x blank equals 1 blank. So what I did was I added 1 to both sides to get those two terms by themselves. Now this left side needs to factor into a binomial squared. And it's going to be x, and because this is a minus, it's going to be minus and then something. This number times 2 is that -4. So that's going to be a -2. -2 times 2 is -4. In this blank, you square that number. So -2 squared is +4. Actually, I'm going to do that in a different color. I'm going to say right here that you square that number. -2 squared is +4. And if you add it to the left, you have to add it to the right. So now we have x minus 2 squared, that's the factored form of that trinomial, equals 5. Okay? We can get rid of the square now by square rooting both sides. Don't forget that that means there's a plus minus in front of that square root of 5. Finish this by adding 2 on both sides, 2 plus or minus the square root of 5. +2 plus or minus the square root of 5. Solve the quadratic equation by using the quadratic formula. And notice I give you the quadratic formula, and on the quiz that quadratic formula will be there. If it says solve using the quadratic formula will be there. Before you do the quadratic formula though, you have to get one side equal to 0. So, ooh, that's funny how it decided to change colors. Get 0 on one side first. Okay, my exclamation points always look funny. So we've got 3x squared minus 6x plus 3 equals 0. I decided to subtract 6x and to add 3 on both sides. I like to keep my a term positive if possible. So a is 3, b is -6, c is 3. So x equals the opposite of b, +6, plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4 times a times c, all over 2 times a. And I always deal with the stuff under the radical first. Oops. I did not mean to delete that when I... Where did it go? Oh my goodness.
Let's delete it for me.
I accidentally hit my button to delete when I was highlighting that. So I always like to do the stuff under the radical first. So don't worry about the radical, just remember that the radical's there. In my calculator, I'm going to type in -6 in parentheses squared minus 4 times 3 times 3, and I get 0. So this is 6 plus or minus the square root of 0. Apparently my daughter's like having a conniption fit over there. Divided by 6. Now watch what happens if you forget those parentheses. -6 squared minus 4 times 3 times 3. You end up with something that is definitely not 0. Those parentheses there are incredibly important. When you're squaring a negative number, you need to put parentheses around it. Okay, now the square root of 0 is simply 0. So this is 6 plus or minus 0 divided by 6, which means it's just 6 divided by 6. And 6 divided by 6 is 1. Okay, let's try another one. Again, we have to get 0 on one side first. So I am going to do, are you quite done, darling?
No.
She's coughing and hacking up a storm. You guys are going to think that we have COVID-19. We don't. We're good still. You can do this negative x squared plus 12x minus 29 if you want to. Personally, I prefer to keep my x squared positive, so I'm going to put 0 on the left side, add x squared to both sides, subtract 12x on both sides, and keep the 29 over there. That just makes my a value positive, and that makes things easier. So my a is 1, my b is negative 12, my c is 29. X equals opposite of b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2 times a. Okay, once again, I have a negative number that I have to square. Anytime you are squaring a negative number, use parentheses. Negative 12 in parentheses squared minus 4 times 1 times 29, 28. So I have 12 plus or minus the square root of 28. Hold on, sweetie, until I'm done with this video. Divided by 2. Now, if you're just putting the stuff under the radical in the calculator, your radical is still there. So a lot of people try to like type in the square root of negative 12 squared minus 4 times 1 times 29. And then they get confused because they have this decimal. Don't include the square root in your calculator. Just do the stuff under the square root and then leave the square root in there. Okay, now you might notice that these answers don't look like this. There must be some simplification that has to happen. So think about the square root of 28. I can split that into the square root of 4 times the square root of 7. So this is 12 plus or minus 2 times the square root of 7 over 2. Okay, I'm seeing some stuff that looks kind of like that, but not quite. These are your whole number pieces. The 12, the 2, and the 2. 12, 2, and 2 all have 2 in common. You can divide all of them by 2. So 12 divided by 2 is 6. 2 divided by 2 is 1. And 2 divided by 2 is 1. Now, do you need those ones? No, you can delete those ones out, and then you don't need the bottom. Your answer is 6 plus or minus the square root of 7. All right, number 12, another solve using the quadratic formula. This time, everything is on one side with equals 0. You can do it like this if you want to. You can switch it around so that it's positive x squared plus 2x plus 4 equals 0. I am going to show you what this looks like if you don't switch it around. So our a is negative 1, our b is negative 2, and our c is negative 4. X equals, oops, on this one I forgot to include the quadratic formula in there, didn't I? I will make sure to fix that and make sure that it's definitely on there for all of the quiz problems that ask you for the quadratic formula. Okay, x equals opposite of b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4 times a times c all over 2a. Okay, the stuff under the radical, not the radical, just the stuff under the radical. I'm going to do negative 2 in parentheses squared minus 4 times negative 1 times negative 4. That gives me negative 12. So I have 2 plus or minus the square root of negative 12, all divided by negative 2. Okay, the square root of negative 12, that's going to involve I. Anytime you have the square root of a negative number, you've got I. So this is really the square root of negative 1 times the square root of 12. The square root of 12 we can split up into the square root of 4 times the square root of 3. So this is 2i square root of 3. So this thing is going to become 2 I times the square root of 3. 2 plus or minus 2I square root of 3, all divided by negative 2. Now again, you'll see some of these answers don't look like this. If I were you, I would use this, this tool right here. You know there has to be an I, so it can't be D and it can't be E. It has to be A, B, or C. That'll at least help you to narrow it down. Then look at the whole number pieces. You've got 2, 2, and negative 2. You can divide all of those by 2. In fact, you can divide them all by negative 2. Divide them both by negative 2. 2 divided by negative 2 is negative 1. 2 divided by negative 2 is negative 1, but why is that going away? Oh, it's because I'm on the fold. Oh my gosh. Okay, so this ends up being negative 1 plus or minus 1I square root of 3. 2 divided by negative 2 makes this a negative 1, but because there's a plus or minus here, it just kind of takes care of that. So your correct answer is negative 1 plus or minus I times the square root of 3. Now, if you would have flipped this around and made this positive x squared plus 2x plus 4 equals 0, basically what you're doing is you're just multiplying everything by negative 1 or moving everything to the other side of the equation. Then this would have ended up being a positive 2 on the bottom, and that would have made simplifying it a little bit easier. So you can try that both ways. You should still end up with this square root of negative 12 regardless of how you do this. So you will still end up with I in your answer. Okay, number 13, I think I'm going to record on a separate video just so that we definitely have enough time to really go through it. So part 3 video will include question number 13.